The evening started the way so many of our dinners did. Good wine, good food. Elena arriving 20 minutes late with a bottle of something expensive and a story about traffic that none of us believed. It had been this way for 15 years. Elena blowing in like a weather event, filling every room she entered with noise and color and energy. Leo always said she reminded him of a firework. Beautiful to watch, just Don and Apos, T stand too close. I laughed at that once. I Don and Apos, T anymore. We were halfway through the pasta when she set down her fork and folded her hands on the table like she was about to open a board meeting. And quote, I need to talk to you both about something, and quote, she said. I assumed it was her job. Elena worked in marketing and had been hinting for weeks about a promotion she and Apos, D been passed over for. Or maybe it was the guy she and Apos, D been seeing, Marcus or Matthew, or something starting with M, who and Apos, D apparently stopped texting her back. End quote. I and Apos, am in love with Leo, end quote, she said. End quote. And I want to share him, end quote. The room didn't end Apos, T go quiet. It went something past quiet. It went into a register I Don and Apos, T have a word for. Leo put his glass down slowly. The kind of slow that means someone is buying themselves time to process something they cannot process. End quote. I get him sometimes, end quote. Elena continued. End quote. You get him sometimes, end quote. She said it exactly the way you and Apos, D explained splitting a streaming subscription. Matter of fact. Reasonable. As though the idea had been so thoroughly workshopped in her own head that she and Apos, D already ironed out all the absurdity. End quote. What are you talking about? End quote. I asked. End quote. I met him first, Veronica, end quote. Her voice was steady. Practiced, almost. End quote. I and Apos, VE loved him longer. If anything, you should be sharing with me. But I and Apos, am not asking for that. I and Apos, am being generous. I and Apos, am letting you keep him part-time, end quote. I felt something cold move through my chest. Not anger. That came later. First came this terrible, creeping recognition. She actually believed what she was saying. This was not a cry for attention. This was not a bad joke. This was a woman who had constructed an entire reality inside her head and had decided tonight was the night to invite us into it. End quote. You and Apos, VE never even dated him, end quote, I said. End quote. Because I was being a good friend, end quote. Her voice rose slightly. End quote. I was being considerate of you. And this is the thanks I get, end quote. She turned to Leo. End quote. Tell her you and Apos, VE thought about me. End quote. End quote. I Haven and Apos, T, end quote, Leo said. His voice was flat. Final. End quote. You have. You and Apos. Regis scared to admit it. End quote. She reached across the table and grabbed his wrist. Leo yanked his arm back hard. End quote. Don and Apos, T touch me. End quote. End quote. See? End quote. She pointed at him. End quote. That reaction. That and Apos, S not nothing. That and Apos, S passion. That and Apos, S him being overwhelmed by what he feels. End quote. End quote. That and Apos, S him being uncomfortable. End quote. I said. End quote. Because you grabbed him without his consent. End quote. End quote. I have been waiting 5 years. End quote. She was standing now, her voice climbing. End quote. 5 years of watching you have everything I deserve. I and Apos, am still being generous. I and Apos, am still willing to include you. Most women would and Apos, T do that, Veronica. Most women would have just taken him. But I and Apos, am offering you a place in this because you and Apos, re my best friend, and I want all of us to be happy. End quote. She hit the table with the flat of her palm. The wine glasses shivered. End quote. Just open your mind. End quote. I stood up. End quote. No. This is insane. You need to leave right now, or our friendship is over. End quote. The anger drained from her face. What replaced it was worse, something cold, and very still, and deliberate. End quote. You and Apos, going to regret making me the enemy. End quote. She said. She picked up her purse. She walked out. The door clicked behind her with the quietness of something that has been closed and will not open again the same way. Leo and I sat at the table for a long time without speaking. The pasta went cold. Somewhere outside, her car started and pulled away. End quote. What the hell just happened? End quote. Leo asked. I didn't and Apos. T have an answer. I still Don and Apos. T, not really. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Sitting there in the silence she and Apos, D left behind. This was not over. We were up until 2 in the morning. Not arguing, Leo and I rarely argue, but planning. Talking through what we knew, what we didn't and Apos. T know what our options were. I kept expecting to feel something clean, like anger or grief. Instead, I felt the specific, low-grade dread of someone who has looked at the board and seen that every move has a cost. Elena had been my best friend for 15 years. We and Apos, D met in college. She and Apos, D held my hand through my father and Apos' funeral, through 2 miscarriages I hadn't and Apos, T told anyone else about, through the worst year of my career. She knew where I kept my spare key. She knew my mother and Apos' maiden name and my ATM pin and the story about the summer I was 19 that I and Apos, VE never told anyone else. And she had been in love with my husband for at least 5 years without saying a word. 2 days after the dinner, she showed up at the door with grocery bags. I saw her through the peephole. My whole body tensed. Leo came up behind me. End quote. Is that her? End quote. He whispered. I nodded. End quote. Veronica. End quote. Her voice through the door was warm and rueful, the voice she used when she thought she and Apos, D gone too far at a party. End quote. I know you and Apos, re-home. Your car and Apos, in the driveway. I just want to talk. End quote. Leo shook his head. I agreed. We wearin' and Apos, T opening that door. End quote. I brought groceries. End quote. She called out. End quote. All your favorites. The good yogurt. That fancy olive oil you like. I want to apologize for how the other night went. I came on too strong. End quote. I looked at Leo. His jaw was tight. End quote. Don and Apos, T. End quote. He said quietly. End quote. I know. End quote. I whispered back. We stood completely still. Elena knocked again, harder. End quote. Veronica. Come on. I and Apos am trying to make things right. Just let me in so we can talk like adults. End quote. I didn't and Apos. T breathed. Finally, I heard her sigh. End quote. Fine. I and Apos, LL leave these here. The yogurt needs to go in the fridge or it and Apos, LL go bad. End quote. A pause. End quote. I love you both. I just want us all to be happy. End quote. Bags rustling. Footsteps. Her car starting. Pulling away. Leo pulled back the curtain slightly and watched her go. End quote. She and Apos, gone. End quote. I opened the door. She and Apos, D left everything she and Apos, D promised. My favorite yogurt, Leo and Apos, protein bars, the expensive olive oil we only get for special occasions. Tucked into one of the bags was a folded note. I and Apos am not giving up on us. Love E. End quote. We should throw all of this away. End quote. Leo said. End quote. We should. End quote. I agreed. End quote. But we and Apos, not going to. End quote. He looked at me. End quote. Next time she comes, we need proof. End quote. I said. End quote. We need to document everything. End quote. Leo nodded slowly. Then his expression shifted. End quote. Veronica, I need to show you something. End quote. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling. End quote. I should have told you sooner. I kept thinking if I ignored her, she and Apos, D stop. End quote. He handed me his phone. It was a text thread. Hundreds of messages. All from Elena. All unanswered. The earliest were from 8 months ago. Hey, just thinking about you. I had a dream about you last night. Do you ever wonder what it would be like if things were different? They got worse as I scrolled. I know you feel it too. You can and Apos, T hide from me forever. Why one and Apos, T you answer me. I see you reading these. I love you so much it hurts. The most recent, from 3 days before the dinner. I and Apos. I'm going to tell her soon. We can finally be together. Just wait for me. My hands were shaking. End quote. How long? End quote. End quote. 8 months that I know of. She made new numbers after I blocked her twice. End quote. His voice was heavy. End quote. I kept hoping she and Apos, D stop. She and Apos, your best friend. I didn't and Apos, T know how to tell you. End quote. I believed him. I could see the weight of it on him. The months of carrying something he hadn't and Apos, T known how to put down. But it also meant this was
Quote,
so much
end
larger
quote.
than I and
The
spare I gave her last year when we went on vacation, end quote. We checked everything after that. Drawers, cabinets, Leo and Apos, home office. That and Apos, where we found it. Tucked inside one of his folders. Our wedding photo. A good one, the two of us laughing at something outside the frame. Except it wasn't Apos, just us anymore. Elena had drawn herself into the picture. A crude sketch. Her face next to ours. A heart drawn around all three of us. On the back, in her handwriting, soon. Leo sat down heavily in his chair. End quote. She drew herself into our wedding photo. End quote. End quote. She and Apos. Been thinking about this for a long time. End quote. I said. I took a picture of the photo with my phone. Evidence. We were going to need all of it. 3 days later, I came home early from work with a headache. The front door wasn't Apos, fully closed. I always lock it. I sat in my car for a moment, heart going fast. I texted Leo, "Are you home?" His response came back immediately. "No, still at work." "Why?" I typed, "Front door is open." His reply, "Don and Apos, go in. Call the police." I didn't and Apos, call the police. I Don and Apos, no. Even now, why I didn't and Apos, Maybe because I already knew who was inside. Maybe because I needed to see it myself before I could believe it. I pushed the door open slowly. The smell hit me first. Garlic. Rosemary. Something roasting. Elena was standing at my stove, wearing an apron I and Apos, never seen before, stirring something in a pot. She looked up when I walked in and smiled the way you smile when a friend arrives exactly when expected. End quote. "Veronica, you and Apos. Home early. Good. Dinner and Apos. Almost ready." End quote. I stood frozen. My best friend had broken into my house and was making dinner. End quote. "How did you get in?" End quote. My voice came out steadier than I felt. She reached into her pocket and held up a key. End quote. "I made a copy. Remember when you gave me your spare last year? I made one before I gave it back. I knew you and Apos. Do you want me to have one eventually?" End quote. She said it like this was a perfectly reasonable sequence of events. I walked to the counter and set my purse down, angling my phone against the fruit bowl. I hit record. End quote. "Elena, why are you here?" End quote. She set down the spoon and turned to face me fully. End quote. "Because I wanted to show you what it could be like. Leo mentioned at that barbecue 2 years ago that he missed home-cooked meals. You and Apos, been so busy with work. I figured I could help." End quote. 2 years. She and Apos, been holding on to something my husband said at a backyard barbecue for 2 years. End quote. I and Apos. Seen things rearranged in the house. End quote. I said. End quote. "How many times have you been in here?" End quote. She didn't and Apos, look embarrassed. End quote. "A few times. I was helping. You never fold Leo and Apos' shirts right. And your spice cabinet was a disaster. I organized it for you." End quote. End quote. "That and Apos. Not helping. That and Apos. Breaking and entering." End quote. She laughed. End quote. "It and Apos. Not breaking and entering when you have a key." End quote. She walked toward me. I made myself hold my ground. End quote. "That and Apos. What love is, Veronica. Anticipating what people need before they know they need it. I and Apos. Loved Leo since the day I met him. I would do anything for him." End quote. She was close enough now that I could see the shine in her eyes. End quote. "I and Apos. Am not trying to take him from you. I just want to love him the way he deserves. The way you and Apos. Too busy to love him." End quote. That one hit like a fist. End quote. "I love my husband just fine." End quote. End quote. "Then why isn and Apos? He happy." End quote. She tilted her head. Genuinely curious. End quote. "I see the way he looks sometimes. Tired. Worn down. He needs someone to take care of him. Let me take care of him, Veronica. Let me take care of both of you." End quote. The front door opened and Leo walked in. He and Apos. Left work the second I texted him. He stopped in the doorway and looked at Elena at our stove. His face moved through 5 expressions in 2 seconds. End quote. "What the hell are you doing here?" End quote. Elena and Apos' whole body changed when she saw him. She straightened. Her face went soft. End quote. "Leo, I and Apos am making your favorite. I remembered you said you missed home-cooked meals." End quote. End quote. "From 2 years ago, End quote. I said. End quote. She remembered exactly what you said. End quote. Leo caught my glance toward the phone on the counter. He understood immediately. Keep her talking. End quote. Elena, end quote. He said slowly. End quote. How did you get in? End quote. She showed him the key again, proudly. Explain the copy. Leo and Apos. S face stayed controlled even as I watched his hands tighten at his sides. End quote. That and Apos. S stalking, end quote. He said. End quote. What you and Apos, VE been doing. The texts, the break-ins, coming into our home. That and Apos. S illegal. End quote. End quote. Don and Apos. TB dramatic. End quote. She waved her hand. End quote. I have a key. It and Apos. S not illegal. End quote. End quote. I and Apos. Am calling the police. End quote. Leo pulled out his phone. What happened next, I still have trouble describing. Elena moved faster than I and Apos. D ever seen her move. She crossed the kitchen and slapped herself across the face. Hard. The sound made me flinch. Her cheek went red immediately. Then she did it again. She stumbled backward and screamed, end quote. Leo, stop. Please stop hitting me, end quote. I lunged toward her. She twisted away and clawed at her own neck, leaving red marks down to her collarbone. End quote. Please, Leo, I won and Apos. Tell anyone. Just stop, end quote. She threw herself against the counter. End quote. Not my face. Please. Not my face, end quote. Leo stood with both hands raised, not touching her, not moving, his face the face of someone watching a building fall. I got hold of her wrists. End quote. Elena. Stop, end quote. I grabbed my phone and stopped the recording. The instant I did, Elena went completely still. The tears stopped as though someone had turned off a tap. She looked at the phone in my hand. She smiled. End quote. You didn't end Apos. Think I saw that? End quote. Her voice was perfectly calm now. Perfectly cold. End quote. You were recording me, waiting for evidence. But all you got is audio of me begging your husband to stop hitting me while you tried to pull him off. End quote. She straightened her clothes. She walked over to Leo, and her voice went soft again. End quote. I and Apos am doing this for us, Leo. Everything I do is for us. One day you and Apos. LL understand that. End quote. She touched his face. He flinched, but didn't and Apos. Move. She kissed us both on the cheek, picked up her purse, and walked out the front door like nothing had happened. We stood in our kitchen. The pot was still bubbling. The whole house smelled like the dinner she and Apos made. Leo and Apos. S voice was barely a whisper. End quote. What just happened? End quote. I played back the recording. She was right. Without the visual of her hitting herself, it sounded exactly like what she and Apos described. Leo and Apos. S voice hard and close. Elena begging. Me pulling at someone. It wasn't and Apos. Evidence. It was a weapon, and she and Apos. Just handed it back to us defused. End quote. Delete it, end quote. Leo said. I did. We changed the locks that night. I lay awake that night going back through 15 years. Elena had never let us meet her mother. Not once. Over the years I and Apos. Suggested it a few times. Dinner, holidays, some casual occasion. And she always shut it down fast. Her mom was complicated. It wasn't an Apos. A good idea. I and Apos. Assumed a difficult relationship and let it go. The way you do when a friend closes a door. I started searching online. Her mother and Apos. S name was Beatrice. It didn't and Apos. Take long. A small news item from 7 years ago. Elena had been hospitalized following a psychiatric episode. There had been a restraining order. There had been a pattern. I read between the lines enough to understand. That looked familiar. I sat with my laptop in the dark and thought about the woman who had held my hand at my father and Apos' funeral. The woman who could read my moods across a crowded room. The woman who had spent 8 months texting my husband without a single response and had taken that silence as a conversation. I thought about how love can calcify into something that no longer resembles love at all, but still believes that it does. I didn't end Apos. Sleep. We met with a lawyer the next morning. Leo had already drafted a timeline. Every text, every incursion, every incident, organized by date with screenshots attached. The lawyer listened without interrupting. End quote. She and Apos. Escalating. End quote. She said when he finished. End quote. The self-harm performance found her number through a mutual acquaintance, a woman who and Apos. D known both of them years ago, and who, when I explained carefully why I was calling, went very quiet and said, end quote, I was wondering how long it would be before someone called me, end quote. Beatrice answered on the second ring. She listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, there was a silence that felt very tired. End quote. I know, end quote, she said. End quote. I and Apos. V known something was wrong for a long time. She was hospitalized 7 years ago. When she got out, she seemed better. I wanted to believe she was better. End quote. End quote. She and Apos. S been escalating, end quote. I said. End quote. I know. End quote. Another silence. End quote. I and Apos. M coming. Don and Apos. T call the police yet. Let me come first. Please, end quote. I told Leo. He thought we should call the police anyway. End quote. Give her an hour, end quote. I said. Beatrice arrived in 53 minutes. She was a small woman, neatly dressed, with Elena and Apos. S eyes and none of Elena and Apos. S fire. She sat in our living room and looked at her hands. End quote. She and Apos. S never been able to accept something she and Apos. S decided she wants, end quote. Beatrice said. End quote. When she was a teenager, it was grades. An exam she failed. She rewrote the entire narrative in her head until she and Apos. D convinced herself she and Apos. D passed, and the school had made an error. End quote. She looked up. End quote. She doesn't and Apos. T believes she and Apos. S doing anything wrong. I want you to understand that. In her mind, this is a love story. End quote. End quote. It and Apos. S not. End quote. Leo said. End quote. No. It and Apos. S not. End quote. Beatrice closed her eyes briefly. End quote. But she can and Apos. T see that. And she never will without intervention. End quote. We heard Elena and Apos. S car in the driveway. I Don and Apos. T know what she expected when she came through the door and found her mother sitting in our living room. Her face moved through surprise, recognition, and then something that looked like relief, before it hardened into betrayal. End quote. You called her. End quote. End quote. We needed help, Elena. End quote. End quote. You called her to take me away again. End quote. She looked at her mother. End quote. That and Apos. SYU and Apos. Re here. You and Apos. Re going to lock me up again. End quote. End quote. I and Apos. Am here because I love you. End quote. Beatrice said quietly. End quote. You love me. End quote. Elena laughed. A short, sharp sound. End quote. You love me so much you put me in a hospital for 6 months. End quote. End quote. You took those pills, baby. You almost died. End quote. End quote. Because the man I loved was marrying someone else, and you let it happen. You could have told her about me. You could have said something. End quote. End quote. That wasn't Apos. T my decision to make. End quote. End quote. It should have been. End quote. Elena and Apos. S voice broke. End quote. Someone should have fought for me. Just once. Someone should have looked at me and said, you matter more. But nobody ever does. Not you. Not Veronica. Not Leo. End quote. She turned to Leo, and her voice dropped to something quieter and more frightening than the anger. End quote. I would have been so good to you. I would have loved you better than anyone ever could. I and Apos. VE spent 5 years becoming the person you deserve. End quote. End quote. Elena. End quote. Leo said. End quote. I and Apos. Am married to Veronica. I love Veronica. That ISN and Apos. T going to change. End quote. End quote. Because you Don and Apos. T know what you and Apos. Re missing. End quote. End quote. I know exactly what I have. End quote. Her jaw tightened. End quote. If I can and Apos. T have him. End quote. She said, and her eyes moved to me. End quote. You Don and Apos. T get to keep him either. End quote. She moved fast. Leo moved faster. He stepped between us and caught her before she reached me, pinning her arms to her sides from behind. She thrashed and screamed and clawed at his forearms. Beatrice was already on the phone. I heard her giving the 911 operator the address. Elena went suddenly still in Leo and Apos' arms. End quote. Do you feel it? End quote. She asked. Her voice had gone completely calm again. That register she shifted into that was more frightening than the screaming. End quote. Right now, you and Apos, re-holding me. Don and Apos. T you feel how right this is? End quote. End quote. I feel nothing but sorry for you. End quote. Leo said. End quote. You and Apos, re-lying. I can feel your heartbeat. End quote. End quote. That and Apos. S because I and Apos. Am scared of you, Elena. End quote. Sirens outside. Elena and Apos. S had snapped up. End quote. No. 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 I and Apos. Am not going back there. End quote. Her voice broke. End quote. Leo, please. I and Apos. LL do anything. I and Apos. LL stop. I and Apos. LL delete the tracker. I and Apos. LL stay away. Just please Don and Apos. T let them take me back there. End quote. End quote. You need help. End quote. End quote. I can and Apos. T be helped. Don and Apos. T you get it? End quote. She went still. Her voice dropped to something hollow. End quote. This is who I am. This is all I am. Someone who loves too much. That and Apos. It's not a crime. End quote. End quote. What you and Apos, V, been doing is, end quote. Leo said quietly. The officers came through the door. They read the room quickly. Beatrice crying. Leo holding Elena, me against the wall, and moved carefully. End quote. Ma and Apos, am. We need you to come with us. End quote. Elena looked at Leo one last time. End quote. I and Apos. LL wait for you. End quote. She said. End quote. However long it takes. End quote. They walked her out between them. She didn't and Apos. T fight. She went like someone who had already left their own body. At the door she turned back and found Leo and Apos. S eyes across the room. She looked at him the way she and Apos. D probably looked at him for years, in rooms he and Apos. D never known about. In a story he and Apos. D never been part of. End quote. You and Apos. LL never know what you missed, end quote, she said. The car pulled away. The sirens faded. Beatrice sat in our armchair with her hands over her face. We stood in the doorway in the dark. End quote. Is it over? End quote. I asked. Leo put his arm around me. He didn't and Apos. T answer. I didn't and Apos. T need him to. I already knew that over is complicated. That some things end without finishing. That the locks were changed and the key was gone and the tracker was off Leo and Apos' car, but the 15 years were still there, still real, still true, still tangled up in everything we were to each other before this. I knew I would grieve that. The friendship I thought I had. The woman I thought she was. And I knew, standing in the cold night air with my husband and Apos' arm around me, that grief and safety are not opposites. We could hold both. We would have to. The restraining order was granted without a hearing. Beatrice called me 3 weeks later. Elena had been admitted voluntarily, the end quote, voluntarily end quote, carrying the kind of weight that word carries when the alternative is a court order. She was on a new medication and working with a specialist who had experience with this pattern. Beatrice said it carefully, in the way of someone choosing every word. I asked how she was. End quote. She and Apos. Her, end quote, Beatrice said. End quote. That and Apos. Both the hard part and the hopeful part. End quote. Leo and I moved apartments 2 months later. Not because we were afraid, exactly. More because we wanted a home that hadn't and Apos. Been moved through without our knowledge. A space that was only ours. The new place has plants in the kitchen. Leo and Apos. Idea. He and Apos. Been cooking on weekends. Home-cooked meals, he said, and smiled like the joke cost him something. I let myself laugh. That and Apos. The thing nobody tells you about surviving something like this. You Don and Apos. Come out the other side unchanged and whole. You come out a little more alert, a little more specific about who gets close, a little more careful with the word best. But you also come out knowing, with a clarity you didn't and Apos. Have before, exactly who is standing next to you. Leo is standing next to me. That and Apos. Enough. That and Apos. More than enough. That and Apos. Everything.